In a world brimming with challenges and change, with crises all around us, we need ideas, innovation, and inspiration. Welcome to the Free Market Roadshow 2024, where the pulse of contemporary discussions beats.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, very warm welcome here in the Winter Garden Campus Erste Bank in Vienna. I hope you could already enjoy the view. My name is Hans Unterdorfer. I'm a member of the board of Erste Bank Österreich, and I want to really warm welcome you all attending this afternoon. It will be a really interesting discussion will follow and presentation will follow, I'm sure. Dear Barbara, Mrs. Dr. Kolm, thank you very much for being here. I think it's a very good old tradition also in this house, but also in Austria, to have open discussion and open-minded exchange of views. So this is one of the most important fundamental. Enjoy the discussion. Thank you very much for being here. And I hand over the micro to Barbara Kolm. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Dr. Unterdorfer. Thank you very much, Hans, for hosting us here in this beautiful premises. Hayek would have loved it. This year is a very special year. We have the 80th anniversary of The Road to Serfdom, which this is this little book that we have translated into a couple of other languages as well. 80 years of the of The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, and it's more relevant than ever. And then we have another anniversary that will be celebrated by us. It's the 50th anniversary of Hayek's receiving the Nobel Prize in Economics. And again, election year, not only in Austria, but across Europe and in many other countries and in the US. I think it's more than overdue to remember what Hayek has told us, not only on how knowledge is created in society, but also about the most important terms with regards to freedom. And lastly, the translation of the Emanzipierte Arbeitnehmer, which is actually the creation of worker capitalists by Jose Pinera. And this is this little booklet that Jose called it the Red Bible. We didn't dare to call it like that, but it's still something that we need to look at, especially given the issues and problems that we face these days in the pension system, especially in Europe and in Austria as well. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the microphone to my colleague, Professor Tokarev, who will introduce our first speaker and run the first interview.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this most beautiful place on this beautiful spring day. The speaker we have at the beginning of our events in Vienna needs no introductions. Nevertheless, I'll just give you a few things you need to know about Richard Rahn. He's an economist, as I am. He earned his PhD from Columbia University. He is also a syndicated columnist and an entrepreneur. And that's very important for me because I come from Northwood University, which is America's free enterprise university, and I see quite a lot of accomplishments in this CV. Richard is currently a chairman of Impossible Success Productions, the Institute for Global Economic Growth. Previously, he served as the vice president and chief economist of the Chamber of Commerce of the United States. He is a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. This is the most exclusive elite economics club. I'm told it's the economics version of the Freemasons. Do you have a secret handshake? And that I'm sure you do. Something that blew my mind is that he also managed to be, in his lifetime, a senior fellow at the Libertarian Cato Institute and a visiting fellow at the Conservative Heritage Foundation. How did you combine that? In 2018, Dr. Rahn was a recipient of the annual Hayek Lifetime Achievement Award. Please welcome Dr. Rahn to the podium. And I watched last week a video. I stumbled upon it as I was surfing the net for some daily news. And on Fox News, I found a video that blew my mind. It seemed like a piece of a comedy show, but it wasn't. It was completely serious. So let's watch together. This is the economics brains behind the current White House administration. So let me get to the video.
The U.S. government can't go bankrupt because we can print our own money.
It obviously begs the question, why exactly are we borrowing in a currency that we print ourselves? I'm waiting for someone to stand up and say, why do we borrow our own currency in the first place?
Like you said, they print the dollar. So why does the government even borrow?
Well, I mean, again, some of this stuff gets, some of the language that some of the language and concepts are just confusing. I mean, the government definitely prints money, and it definitely lends that money, which is why the government definitely prints money, and then it lends that money by selling bonds. Is that what they do? They sell bonds. Yeah, they sell bonds, right? Since they sell bonds and people buy the bonds and lend them the money. Yeah. So a lot of times, at least to my ear with MMT, the language and the concepts can be kind of unnecessarily confusing, but there is no question that the government prints money and then it uses that money to yeah, I guess I can't really talk. I don't get it. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, because it's like the government clearly prints money. It does it all the time, and it clearly borrows. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this debt and deficit conversation. So I don't think there's anything confusing there.
Now, we're here to talk about global debt, the global debt crisis of not just the United States, many sovereign nations. What's interesting is that America begins as a political project that has a lot to do with debt. When America won its independence from Britain, the founders gathered in Philadelphia to address the issue of the new country's debt. At the time, it was less than 30% of the GDP. They ended up writing a constitution which granted the federal government the power to directly tax the citizens instead of relying on funding from the states. And that should have been the end of the question of debt. For many years, Washington handled its fiscal needs responsibly, just as you and I do as individuals. Occasionally, of course, they would need to borrow some money, but they would try not to leave the next generation any debt, as we don't like to leave any debts to our children. Within a lifetime, the national debt was paid off. Then came the Civil War, this fratricidal conflict, and our debt, once again, went back to about 30% of the GDP. And then, after the war, it was on its way to be paid off again. Then we elect Wilson, and he throws America, despite his campaign promises, into this useless war in Europe. I'm talking about the First World War. The peace treaty that was signed under pressure, and Wilson is probably the chief force behind this. The peace treaty had devastating consequences, as we all know. And one of the things it did was pave the way for Hitler to be elected in Germany. The Great Depression that came in the 1930s gave the President of the United States, FDR, an excuse to permanently grow government spending. After the Second World War, the best that we could do was going back down to 30% of our GDP. When we won the Cold War, the debt was about 50% of the GDP. And in just 35 years after Reagan, and without any global wars or existential crisis, we managed to push it all the way to more than 120% today. We carry the unbelievable obligation to pay $35 trillion. No one can imagine what $35 trillion looks like. As an American taxpayer, I'm told that my fair share of this debt is around $250,000. And by the time that my 2 children retire, and assuming no inflation, their share will be more than $1 million each. So in our conversation with Richard Rahn today, I hope we can find the answers to a few questions. One of them is when we lost our fiscal sanity. How is our debt affecting our political process and our economic choices? Do we need to collapse before we gather the will to fix our problems? If America elects Richard Rahn as its fiscal czar, and if we give you the absolute power over taxation and spending, including the power to abolish the Fed, how would you address this problem? We'll start with a look at the situation in several countries, a snapshot of countries that are doing well and countries that are doing not so well.
So I accept your honor to be the fiscal and monetary czar of the United States because the man you saw up there earlier, Jared Bernstein, who is Biden's chief economic advisor, he's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. I've known him a number of years, and it is indeed true, he's an idiot. He also has a PhD from Columbia Universities, but it was in social work rather than economics. And only Biden would pick him as the chief economist. He's pleasant, but he obviously knows nothing. I would also fire the Fed chairman, and I would abolish the Fed. You might ask, why do countries have central banks? Most countries did not have a central bank up until around the time of the First World War, when we went off the gold standard. The Swedes were the first ones to come up with a central bank back in 1635. I'm not quite sure why they did that. But, Financing war, yeah. Because central banks enable you to print money, particularly if you're on a gold standard and you can't just go ahead and create it out of thin air. If you come up with a fiat currency like we all have, the central bank is very good. Can you hear me? Is very good at taking nothing and selling it to others who know nothing. And we have the situation, it's like your own situation. If you borrow a little bit, it's well within your incomes to pay your mortgage or your credit cards, that's fine. You can expand, increase your standard of living, and you're borrowing today to have a better living tomorrow. Have a better living today it's expensive tomorrow, but within limits, there's nothing wrong with that. But when you start going ahead and spending more than you can actually afford, and particularly when it gets up more than your income, there's a big problem. The U.S. had been very, actually quite reasonable in our debt issuance as a percentage of GDP. As my colleague mentioned, the last time we ran a sustained surplus and had the debt paid off was under President Andrew Jackson, and it was 1845. And during the Civil War, we increased debt because they had to finance the Civil War, but they paid off a lot of it during the latter part of the 19th century. And during World War II, we greatly borrowed a lot, as all the countries did, but we paid much of that off in real terms. I'm talking about real terms, the percentage of GDP. And after the post-war years, and it continued to go down as a percentage of GDP, and we actually ran a surplus for 3 years when Bill Clinton was president and Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House of Representatives. We ran a very good fiscal policy in the late 1990s. And then we had 9/11, which was an excuse to spend more money. And then the recession in 2008, and everything took off. And then the pandemic, which governments, the U.S. in particular, but other governments decided, well, we can't have people going to work because they may infect each other. We can't have people going to school because they may infect each other. But we don't want people to suffer income, so we'll just give them money. The problem was you weren't producing any real goods and services. You were just creating money. And that, of course, led to the big inflation that we had over the last few years, particularly in the United States. Now, you've gotten a situation where, I'll start off with the U.S., our debt is now more than 100% of our GDP. So far, Austria, Germany, Hungary have been reasonably responsible. And the Swiss, of course, are all responsible. The problem is if you have debts of this level as a percentage of GDP, you're really crowding out the private sector. Start off with the basics. People save money. Companies save money. That money they can put either into productive use, producing new plant and equipment, what we call a capital formation, new semiconductor plants, new shopping centers, or what have you, or they can use it to buy government debt. When they're buying government debt, they're not creating any future wealth. And what they're doing is crowding out spending, government spending that could be used for more useful or perhaps less harmful things. So now we have these countries with a big debt, and we need to increase defense spending. And that's a long story into itself. Where's the money going to come from? This year in the U.S., we'll pay more on interest than we'll pay on defense. And eventually, the interest is going to crowd out much of the social spending, and it diminishes your rate of economic growth. Germany's in stagnation. The UK is in stagnation. Much of the rest of Europe is in stagnation. And ironically, only the U.S. is growing. Now, the way the U.S. is managing to grow despite the big debt is that we are ripping off the rest of the world. Interest rates are higher in the U.S. The productive rate of return tends to be higher. So you have, let's say, like a farmer in Nigeria, or maybe it has a small mill. He's able to save a little bit of money. That money he puts in a local bank in Nigeria, may have a corresponding bank account with a bank like HSBC or whatever. That bank, in turn, takes the money and buys U.S. government bonds. And what we're doing is finding now a flood of the world's capital buying U.S. government bonds, which means the poor of the world are subsidizing the rich. I spent half the year living in Miami. Miami is an absolute boom town. And we live very, very well in Miami. Full employment. The economy is booming in every possible way. They're building new 100-story buildings. There's beautiful condos. Starts off prices with more than $1 million being built all over the place. Okay, where's that money coming from? It's coming primarily from Latin America, from Brazil, Argentina, a lot of the other Latin American countries, from Central America. Because the wealthy there, they don't reinvest in their own economies because of the lack of rule of law and the other problems they have. But they're all buying luxury condos in Miami. Under U.S. law, if you invest heavily in the U.S., you can automatically have entry and live in the U.S. So they have that as their insurance policy, their escape, and also they're making more money by investing in the U.S. Now that's wonderful for those of us who live in Miami. It's terrible for the rest of the world, and particularly the poorer countries. Traditionally, the rich countries poured capital into the poor countries. When the British were building their empire, they built railroads all over the world. They built them in the U.S., Canada, Australia, India. They were taking savings from the British people and taken them back to the colonies to build railroads, productive capital formation. Now we're doing just the opposite. And this is madness. It's not sustainable. And so what you've had now, over the last 4 years, is the U.S. is growing as a share of world GDP. Despite all of our economic problems in the U.S., we're getting bigger compared to the rest of the world. At the end of the World War II, the U.S. was about 30% of world GDP. That slowly diminished over time, and it got down to about 20% as Europe grew more rapidly, Southeast Asia and other places grew rapidly. Well, Europe has stopped growing as a percentage of GDP, and you had the Chinese coming from no place to having about 17% of the world GDP. And there was all these articles, you probably saw them, when is the Chinese going to overtake the U.S.? Well, a strange thing happened 4 years ago. The U.S. growth rate picked up, the Chinese growth rate fell, and now the U.S. is gaining on China as a percentage of GDP. And you say, well, I mean, again, for those of us in the U.S., this is wonderful. For the rest of the world, it's madness. And I want to thank all of you for subsidizing my lifestyle. I do appreciate it.
Wonderful explanation of the economic impacts of increased government debt, both on the rich and the poor countries. You gave us an example, a Nigerian farmer who may be saving some money, putting in a bank, the money ending up being spent by the US government. I just finished grading the final exam, so my students, most of them take economics of public policy, and that was one of the issues that we discussed during the semester. So I wonder how this reliance on ever-growing indebtedness in the wealthy countries affects our political process. I remember how back in the 1970s, when the Arab countries imposed an embargo on the US, the supply of oil globally fell, the price of oil and gasoline quadrupled, and countries such as Nigeria, that have a lot of this natural resource, managed to find themselves in a position that they had a lot of revenue, and it corrupted completely their political process. They started relying and planning ahead on huge revenues from the export of oil. It gave the people in power the ability to bribe with promises of government spending, people to vote for them. And then in the 1980s, with the Reagan economy, the price of gasoline dropped significantly, and they found themselves with a lot of debt, and no one wanted to lend them anymore. So how is, for the Western world, the United States, the European Union, this heavy reliance on funding all government projects year after year, corrupting the very soul of the political process and all the parties, whether they are in opposition or in government, how they start to act in trying to bribe them, their way into power?
Yeah. When governments have access to money, politicians will use it to buy votes. In the U.S., President Biden has been abolishing student debt for a lot of the students who borrow the money, and he said, oh, you don't have to pay it back. The problem is everybody else is paying it. The money, the debt doesn't disappear because the president says you don't have to pay it. You're just shifting the debt burden from people who have productive jobs to non-productive students, or people who may be out of school, but he thinks he's going to buy that constituency. You see it all around the world. Politicians have always engaged in vote buying. But when you have lack of discipline about the growth in the money supply, when politicians think they have an unlimited checkbook to go off there and buy votes, they buy all kinds of projects, highways, whatever constituency the politician is trying to reach. Maybe for dock workers, he says, I'll build a new port or new airport or whatever, whether it's justified or not. And so vote buying has been true since the time, at least the Romans, or before that. I mean, all the things that are happening today, if you go back and read the history of Rome, was all done. We haven't done anything new. We just carried it a step further. It took the Romans a long time to spend themselves into bankruptcy. We're just doing it much quicker.
Now, maybe since you mentioned the way that governments started relying on money that they haven't been even able to tax away from the citizens, the interview that Biden's economic advisor was giving here gave us a snapshot of a few very unorthodox ideas. The idea that, well, we have a central bank. So what is exactly stopping us from just writing on a piece of paper, I owe $1 trillion if I'm the government, and I give it to the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank or any other central bank, and they gave us their federal notes or their cash. So we would spend as much money as we need. Why is that not a feasible way to handle government spending and projects?
It's totally feasible. And that's what governments used to do. Well, state and local governments particularly do that now. If they're going to have a new project, they spend it, let's say they're going to build a new road, and they'll give the contractors the money as they're spending to build the road. You can have a productive government spending. Let's say the government builds a hydroelectric dam, and the benefits from the dam in terms of electricity generation, flood control, irrigation exceed the cost. That's useful. It's productive capital formation. But most government spending is just taking money from Barbara there to me, and because Barbara's an unworthy Austrian and I'm a very worthy American, but and so you get this. The thing is, Bernstein's comments in many ways were very dangerous because a lot of people are going to say, yeah, why don't we just go ahead and write the checks? Why do we do all this bond stuff in between? Well, there's a long history of why we do it, but there's no reason to do it. In fact, we have the most bizarre system in the U.S. The Treasury Department, let's see, each month they have bills exceeding revenues, say average of $100 billion a month or a couple $100 billion a month of bills they can't cover. So they issue new government debt in the form of government bonds. These bonds, the Treasury is not allowed directly to sell to the public or the banks. So they sell them to the Fed in an auction. And there are 6 primary dealers, big banks, who bid on these. And the bid is sort of rigged and the interest rates hardly vary. And then the banks buy these bonds and immediately turn around and sell them often back to the Fed or also others. And then the Fed came up with a scheme a couple of years ago of requiring the banks to increase their reserves at the Fed, but the Fed paid money on the reserves. What you're doing is printing money to pay people to print more money. A lot of the U.S. government debt is owned by foreign governments or foreign institutions. The Japanese own more than $1 trillion. The Chinese almost that much. And then if you go through, I don't know if you got the chart there, but they go through the holdings, who owns the U.S. government debt, and the official holdings are Cayman Islands owns $326 billion of U.S. government debt. There are 56,000 people in Cayman. I used to be on the board of directors. I was the first non-Canadian to be on the board of directors of the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, which oversees all the regulations of banks, insurance companies, produces the money, controls all this stuff. Now, clearly, those 56,000 people in the Cayman are not buying $326 billion in U.S. government debt. In fact, we had about $3 trillion of money going through Cayman each year. It's this little island. Nice beaches, good restaurants. I recommend it. In the middle of winter, go there. It's very, very nice. It's amazing what $3 trillion of other people's money can do. And so the goal of those of us who are overseeing this stuff was to keep the game clean but free. And we did a pretty good job of it. But the reason all that flows through Cayman, Jersey, Guernsey, Hong Kong, to a lesser extent Bermuda and some of the others, Cayman being the big one. Cayman has 80% of all the funds business on the planet Earth. We had 80%. I mean, that's amazing. Again, it's tiny little islands. The area is probably smaller than the city of Vienna, 24 miles long. And again, there's the few natives who run the service industry, and there's a bunch of Brits and Americans and Germans and Austrians who actually run the place. And it does work out for the rest of the world. But so you have, but the way it is, all the money flows. Let's say you've got a French dentist. French dentist has a little savings account, and he has it maybe with Citibank in Paris. That money from Citibank is then consolidated in a place like Cayman because there's no fees of going in and out, no taxes, no transfer fees. It transfers seamlessly. So it's a good place to store money. Then Citibank can accumulate all those little deposits from the various dentists around the world and decide if they're going to build a semiconductor plant in Taiwan or Michigan or Australia or wherever. And that's sort of how this world finance system works. But it's increasingly operating on the basis of money without any backing at all. And again, that works as long as you've got only a limited amount out. But when you get too much out, eventually the thing is going to collapse. I watch this thing, and because I've been in the inside of it now for the last 50, 60 years, it's scary to the outside world. It's even more scary when you're inside and know how the whole thing is constructed, because it is indeed a house of cards. And I was just meetings in Berlin, and looking at it, it's going to come tumbling down, and there's no way that's sustainable. And we've seen what you say, well, when it comes down, what happens? Go to Greece. Greece had, it's been 15 years since they had their currency collapse, about that. And, you know, the buildings didn't fall down and stuff. But the average Greek is about 30% poorer than they were 15 years ago. And that's what's going to happen to much of the world. Now, where is that going to cause revolutions? A lot of places, I mean, here in Austria, you're good, civilized, law-abiding folks. 30% cut in income, you're not going to like it, but you can live with it. A lot of places in the world are not going to live with it. And you're going to have various types of riots, disturbances, governments being taken down. It's not going to be a very pretty picture. Eventually, the world starts over again and develops a new monetary system. And I said I'm a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist for mankind. But it's, I think people say, what should you do? Well, diversify. I mean, there's no simple answer for all this, but having some real estate, some hard assets, stocks in good companies. Good companies don't disappear. There'll be some, it'll be plenty of companies weathered the Great Depression and other downturns, and that will happen again. Or you can put your money in Chile, because Jose Pinera, our colleague here today, actually worked out a system where Chile could have sustainable pension systems forever. And he's been trying to sell that to the rest of the world. And one aspect of a global collapse will be a lot more people will adopt the Chilean system.
Well, thank you very much for this last remarks.
I need to add one thing.
I-
I apologize for having such a depressing talk. I commented to Barbara earlier, I was just in Berlin for 3 days and dealing with meetings of the international situation. And first we dealt with the Mideast war, then Ukraine, Russia. And by the end, after 3 days of this, we all wanted to shoot ourselves. And we hadn't even got into the global debt crisis yet. I mean, the world is in for a very rough period here over the next 6 months to 3 years. And I don't know how we get out of it. Things always happen. We can't predict. But it's not going to be pleasant. But be of good cheer anyway.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much, Alex.
Use this experience to fuel your aspirations. Be part of the change. Let's explore, learn, and grow together. Secure your spot now.